Are you guys ready for this? We've got 2 more heat sinks to do, and this is from Pablo. And I want to thank Pablo for this opportunity. Pablo made the contribution to make this possible. This is the JEYI M.2 Heatsink Aluminum FinsCold iGlacier8. That looks like a big heat sink. Okay, we're going to go through what we test for. Number 1, a dual M.2 NVMe adapter. Number 2, we're looking for something that'll work on a quad card that should have a heatsink that doesn't, and the number 3 is going to be on the motherboard. So we're going to test it in 2 places, on the dual M.2 NVMe adapter and on the motherboard. We have a heatsink list of what we've tested, that when we get to that point, we'll go through the list and itemize. I've made a few changes in it where I've done some highlights, so I hope it'll be easier to understand some of the nomenclature and the syntax of what we've used. For example, this is heatsink number 13, first one from JEYI. We've looked at some other products, I've got to say right now, from JEYI that I was not happy at all. JEYI makes 1, a dual M.2 NVMe adapter, and number 2, they make a quad adapter. Both of those, you guys will never see the video on that, but stay away from that. Those are terrible products. So I'm eager to see what JEYI does with this. And as Pablo said, someone's got to beat the Acidalie. We'll see. So we're going to start with an unboxing. And of the 4 things we do, the unboxing, the inspection, the installation, and the test. Overhead. Now both products are in this sack, so we'll give this an open. And we're going to do these in succession, so we will not be having a cold boot with both of them. Let's open this and start with our unboxing, and then we'll do our installation. And I got to tell you, I wonder sometimes how you guys find this stuff, because when all the looking I did for the 6 that I chose and the other 6 that y'all chose, this one never came up in my radar. It's sealed. I like that. Looks like this box has been around a little bit. And by definition, how that compares, they call this a JEYI M.2 heatsink Shark Grills Glacier 8. And there's no mention of Shark Grills here. All it says is heavy-duty aluminum passive heatsink. Fascinating. Well, so the description we'll use will be the JEYI M.2 Aluminum FinsCold iGlacier8. So the fact that it's sealed, I appreciate that. And the way that's designed, oh, they've even got a tab on there. I could pull that tab, but I'll tear that label. I want to check that label out for clarity, and so people looking for this can find it. Okay, I'm going to cut the seal open because I want to preserve that label. So this tells me nobody's been into the box, which I appreciate, because I'm always eager on an unboxing to see how something's been packaged. And I'm kind of fascinated by this because this thing is kind of big, and it's got the 3 main components we're looking for. It's got the wraparound heatsink, and of course it'll have 2 thermal pads, and they specify using both thermal pads. Some only come with 1 thermal pad. Of course we have our notch on one end, so we're going to have to be aware of that when we line it up. But this thing's massive, and this is machined. Okay, we have 3 screw holes on the side, and this is what I'm looking for. These screw holes on the mount, these are elongated. So for anyone asking if this will fit in a PS5, which is something else that we're looking at, no, it will not. It's too tall. Now I'll be assembling this from this direction, which is opposite of being able to read this, and this is called the Warship. I've heard others talk about the Warship. This is the Warship Pro. So I hope JEYI does a better job with a heatsink than they do with a dual adapter or a quad adapter. We're going to find out. And looking at alignment, the way that sets up, there's an absolute alignment with the way the wraparound fits. In other words, there's no variance. That goes right into that channel. And you can see where the holes are at. So this should work with dual-sided memory and as well as single-sided. So I'm sure there's going to be a couple of thermal pads, and there may be some instructions we're going to check out. Okay, let's see what we got in the box. We'll set the heatsink aside. Fantastic. Instructions. I hope that's not all in Chinese. And it is, so that's going to be helpful. And a QR code that will take us to their website. That's helpful. 3 thermal pads. And we have our screwdriver and our screws. Good. And it's JEYI.com. We'll have that in the description, as well as the link on Amazon. And one of our subscribers asked for a list of all the heat sinks. We have a playlist of those heat sinks, but I will also put that list of all those heat sinks from 1 through 13 and 14 in the description. So it'll be easy to find. And we got to talk about what we're testing with. Okay, because our test started, which has changed and evolved, when I get to the chart, I'll explain all that. But we're going to be working with the Supermicro dual M.2 NVMe adapter. That'll be our first test. And we're going to be testing with the first drive, the WD Black SN850. both of these drives, including the Samsung 980 Pro, these are both PCI Express 4.0 second generation drives. So they're capable of a read of 7,000 megabytes. Now the WD Black runs a little hotter, runs a little faster than the Samsung 980 Pro. And both of these had the firmware update done to them. It was required to apply the firmware on the WD Black on one of the quad adapters. It was not required, but since we did it, we were asked, so we've applied firmware to both. So that's where that stands. And this is an exceptional adapter. So the first test will be on this adapter with this heatsink, and we're going to see how those two perform and what kind of spacing we've got as we look at the machine, and I'll get into that in a minute, because change one thing changes everything, and details matter. Now I like to do a dry fit, so again we're going to be assembling this direction, and I need to check out the screwdriver and the screws, of which there are quite a few. So we're going to need 6, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. One extra screw, fantastic, and a screwdriver, which looks like is magnetic. And let's get our 3 pads out, and these are Ziploc bags, which I appreciate. Let's see what those look like. I'm going to try to stay zoomed in as much as I can, as long as I can. If the camera goes in and out of focus, it's because it's trying to figure out who's on first. So sometimes we may lose focus. And we can see we have a very thin pad, a thickest one in the middle, and then this thinner one. Instead of guessing, let's measure. I'm curious. Okay, let's go for the thinnest one. That comes in at 0.4, and this other one is actually those little cut-ups, which I don't care for. This one comes in at 0.8. Wow, I was off on that. 0.4, 0.8, and the thickest one is 1 millimeter. Okay, that'll be the top, and that also tells me the thinnest one we will not use, but that would probably be what you would use for the double-sided. Something like the Seagate Firecuda 530. I believe it's double-sided. And I believe also the Sabrent Rocket 4, which is PCI Express 4, first generation, those are double-sided. Remember, PCI Express 4, there's a first, second, and third generation. And we're dealing with these two drives that are second generation. So they're capable of about 7,000 megabytes. The PCI Express 4.0 version 3 drives are good for 7,300 megabytes on the 2 terabyte and above, and almost 7,000 megabytes on the right, just a little bit below it. So high performance, 2 things required. 1, the Phison E18 controller, number 2, using the Micron flash memory, according to AMD and Phison about their I/O optimization that they talked about, which we'll probably get into again later. So okay, we've measured the pads. So I like to do a dry assembly. We're going to take the thickest pad, which will be on the top, set it aside. We'll use the other one that's been cut into squares. We're going to lay that on the bottom. Now, because of the size of the film that covers this, I cannot dry assemble this, which is kind of a bummer. As I've said before, and I'll say again, the labels stay on, otherwise I would not know who is on first. And because this is an uneven surface, a thermal pad makes more sense than thermal paste. And I think the thin pad is too thin for the bottom. So this pad that's cut into squares that they may intend to go on top of dual-sided, we're going to use it on the bottom of this single-sided. But I'm going to have to go ahead and apply it. I cannot dry fit it, which is kind of a bummer. Now, this is a stock installation with what's in the package. To improve the thermal conductivity would be to do something like where you would change the thermal pads. Oh, that's something else I want to show you right quick. While I'm thinking of it, this is the first heatsink I've seen where they give a total thermal conductivity of the W over MK value, 203 W over MK. I've never seen one give a complete package. We're always looking at the thermal pads for their thermal conductivity. So if you know the formula, you know how to do the math, you can take that and translate it. But I find it fascinating. And information about the item, you take a look at that right quick for those that are interested. After the product's installed on the motherboard, talking about the height and the width under normal situations will not affect the use of the CPU heatsink or graphics cards. But please pay attention to whether your motherboard has enough space to install this heatsink. See, that's a very good point. Because of the size of this, well, I'll get to that when we get ready to install it on the motherboard. We have, I'll go ahead and tell you right now, we're using the Gigabyte TRX40 Designaire, which gives us 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots. We have 4 M.2 NVMe connectors on the motherboard. 1 and 2 are to the CPU. 3 and 4 are through the chipset. Okay, the fastest ones on 1 and 2, we're going to be using connector number 2. It's going to be listed in the heatsink chart where you can see at a temperature that we achieved on that heatsink. Okay, the reason I mention that now is because this heatsink, because of the size of it, will fit in that location. In the primary location on the motherboard, I think it'll be a problem. Now, what I've just said, I'll go back through that and you can see where space relations are at, because we're always talking about PCI Express resources, but with this, we're looking at how we're going to keep these drives cool, because what we've learned, the faster they go, the hotter they get. Vendors are coming up with some creative solutions on how to solve that and how to achieve that goal. We're going to see how this works. And how's it going to work? I have no idea. I've learned enough to know. The more I learn, the more I need to know, because I realize the more I learn, how little I know. Change one thing, changes everything. Take all assumptions, out the door. Let's go back. The heatsink has a screw-fixed frame and includes 2 high-conductivity thermal compound pads that can fill the gap of the SSD. Of course, that's where we're going to get our compression because of these side screw holes. They're elongated. So for this, if we have 2 thermal pads, when the screws are tightened, the heat dissipation of the SSD will be, it says faster, will be greater. The soft thermal compound pads can make the solid heatsink base gently touch the SSD without damaging. Yes, rough translation. Supports all types of M.2 NVMe SSDs. Tightening the screws and stick the thermal pad on the chips and the back works especially for the Samsung 980 EVO, the WD Black SN850, which runs a little hotter. And according to JEYI's experiment, temperatures can be reduced by at least 10 to 30 degrees Celsius. Let's take a look at the specs on the drive so we can compare all that. Now this is the spec sheet on the WD Black SN850, and over here on the last page, bottom right, talks about system compatibility and shows operating temperature and non-operating temperature. Gives 70 degrees centigrade and a non-operating temperature of 85 degrees. Somewhere I had seen 80, and that says 70. Okay, so we want to stay below 70, and I think we've seen below 60. So let's see how close that gets to below 70. And going on down, looking at the description, aluminum body with a black anodized finish. They call it oxidation. And I gather that the wraparound is also aluminum. Yeah, here it is, compatible with single and double-sided. So let's get this together and see how well it works. No description about this third pad. So based on the thickness of it, we're going to use these others. And I do not like these type that have these little squares. But it is what it is. Because typically what I like to do is peel one side off, lay it down, and then once it's on its surface where it's going to stay, then peel the top off. That's not going to work this way. I'm going to have to play with these little squares, and they are already dancing on me. But it's on the bottom. And I am going to do a dry run with the memory. I need to get some kind of orientation with the drive, not only for the cutout where the screw goes, but the notch here on the back bottom right where the connector goes. So I want to get an eyeball on that right quick. And there's plenty of cutout on the left. I'll zoom back in on that for the 0 at this location. And we've got plenty of cutout on the back for this location. That's the most of any of them. But it covers the memory, and that's all that's necessary. And this is what I wanted to evaluate, because the memory on the card will come just about even with here. So when I'm putting these pads on, I'll start from here, work my way back, because we're going to have the controller, and then the rest of this will be memory. So I want to be sure we cover all the memory. And just a quick glance, holding my finger on that so it doesn't fall, looking at the back, yeah, there's a nice amount of space for that connector right there to stick through. Good. That's what I want to find out. Okay, just an eyeball, so I know what I'm dealing with. Something else I just realized I'm not real fond of. Let me show you this. As I'm doing this, the length of this pad and the length of this drive, I've never had a pad come up short. Now granted, it's covering the memory as I just discussed, but I've never had a pad sent by a vendor with a heatsink that does not also cover the controller, which, yes, and that really should be the other way around. Keep the controller cool, let the memory get hot. So that pad is a little bit short, in my opinion, which tells me the intention must have been to have used this red pad on the bottom, which doesn't make a lot of sense, which is the same question the viewer that had the PS5 asked, because red you would think hot, so red would go on top. Blue would think cool, cool would go on the bottom. And I kept asking about the thickness of the pads, and he couldn't tell me the thickness. Well, we'll go according to color coding. But this red pad is too thin. I want to use this. So I'm going to split the difference. My other option is to use pieces of thermal pads that I have left over from the thermal Grizzly. But again, we need to use what's in the package and find out and establish how this is configured from the manufacturer. So I'm going to split the difference, and I'm going to put this in the center of where the memory would sit, which would put that back at about the screw holes on the side, which would be, see if we can come in for a close-up on that, starting right here. So the pad will go from here down to here for the bottom. I've never had to make that decision about a heatsink before with the thermal pads that are included, but I wanted to point that out in case some of you are confronted by that. So I'm going to see if I can drop this in and get an alignment. Nope, it's going to all come apart. So what I'm going to do is trim off one side with a pair of scissors, that clear plastic. I need a clean edge to make this easy to install. Sometimes you think, what were vendors thinking? Okay, that's much better. I think this thermal pad was an afterthought with these squares, and I think it's a bad afterthought. It'd be a whole lot simpler to put one thermal pad in here that's solid than having to play around and monkey with that, because now I've got to go back through there, cut those edges off. That's just dumb. Let's see how well the memory's going to fit in there like it is. Yep, snapped in. Perfect. Pushes the drive a little bit to one side, but I'm okay with that. Be sure the alignment is good. I zoomed out because I thought I was going to have more stuff. I'll zoom back in. Let's make sure our alignment is good here on the left, and our alignment on the rear is good. We've got probably 1/8 of an inch there clearing that notch. And I did not have to go in there and cut. I just rolled those edges, and now I'm going to push that down as long as this stays put, and it'll snap in. Yeah, okay, that works. My concern is when I put the top on, because that goes down on the inside, it still clears. And I get some compression right there. I haven't even put the top pad on. Okay, so that'll clear. In other words, that pad will clear these sides, even though I should have cut them off. Not going to do it. So now we'll go for the pad on top. And this thermal pad has its surface sized exactly correct. So this and I will roll and place full length. Okay. After I tested JEYI's quad adapter and dual adapter, I thought, well, I won't be looking at any more JEYI products. And then Pablo came up with this. I said, okay. Okay, that looks pretty good. Yeah, that'll do. Okay. JEYI could simplify this if they would include a different thermal pad, but that's just me. I like to keep things simple, make it work. Okay, we're watching our notch here on the left, both of those. So we want to be sure when we put this in, and as you can see, that's machined where that fits down in that groove. So there's no wrong way to position this. It just goes straight in. And as you can see, those screws are about in the middle. So when I press on this and compress, we should get some good compression on this. So now we need to get these screws in, get them started. Well, the screwdriver may be magnetized, but it's not magnetized enough. So I'm using another screwdriver, better suited for the task. These screws have a nice large surface head on them, so that'll help with the grip for compression. Glacier8, well, that's another new name. So that's, I guess, what, 4 names now we've come up with for this one heatsink. Fascinating. And one extra screw, appreciate that. Bag it and tag it. Set that aside. Now, with my thumb and forefinger, I'll start on one end, and holding this sandwich together, I'll rotate this around. First of all, let's look here at our orientation. That looks pretty good. That's a wicked looking heatsink. It's different, it's tall, but with the screws in the middle, we should get good compression with this. Rotate that right around. You can see right there the notch sticking up. We've got good clearance when that goes in from the heatsink. It's interesting the way that's machined on one side. Is it going to be more effective? I have no idea, but I am curious. So is Pablo, and I'm sure so are the rest of you. Okay, we'll start on this end, and I'm going to work left and right. So we'll go number 1 as I compress, roll it over. Number 2, then keeping pressure on it. Catch number 3, roll it over. Catch number 4, and then we'll go ahead and secure these 2 middle screws, 5 and 6. Complete. Okay. The tedious part was messing with that silly thermal pad, but it is what it is. I was really tempted to go ahead and put the other thermal pad on there, but you know, change one thing changes everything. And what we want to find out is the stock result first before we modify anything, because we're only going to take on the list the top maybe 2 or 3. One of them because we're looking for a solution for a laptop. And then we got into the thing about the PS5, so you guys were asking, so we had to modify. Okay, first test on the Supermicro. So we got to get this mounted. So much for the inspection. Now for the installation. Let's see, weight-wise, yeah, it's got some weight to it. I don't know for the size of this. This would not have been my first choice, but hey. Now, would I put 2 of those on that card? And again, that's the Supermicro Dual M.2 NVMe adapter. And on the test we're getting ready to perform, we will achieve just over 7,000 megabytes with a WD Black SN850 and just under 7,000 megabytes with a Samsung 980 Pro. Yep, we're clear here on the back. I always like to look at that, and that's got good clearance from that one component. So our first test will be on this dual adapter. Second test will be on the motherboard. They always run cooler on the dual adapter. Now, next thing someone's going to ask is about the room temperature. So I'll bring that up so we can take a look at it, and we're going to get this card installed in the machine. So right now we are at 41% humidity, which is a little bit lower, and the temperature is 82 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about on par with usually where it's at, because I've got lights in here. Even though it's cooler outside, temperature's changing going into fall. These lights, even though they're LEDs, generate some heat, so keeps things warm. And of course your test may vary. Now the piece de resistance, let's get this in the machine. Okay. What we have on the 2 connectors, again for the M.2 NVMe, that go directly to the CPU. Number 1 is just under this quad card, which has 4 M.2 NVMe drives on one card that requires one 16-lane slot bifurcated in the BIOS. This card also requires bifurcation in the BIOS. That's already been set. But my concern is, because of the height of this heatsink, with this setting right here at the first slot, which is tucked just under, if your video card were, say, 1 slot wide, that would be tight. If, however, you're using something like we have here, which is an EVGA RTX 2080 Ti, which is 2 slots wide, if that were over here, trying to get to that location right there, no, ain't going to happen. So we're going for location number 2 right here that's still open, where there's nothing above it. We're straight up. The question is, can we go down on that slot with this card, which is going to be in the first 8-lane slot? No, it will not fit. We cannot test that heatsink on that card in that location. It's that tall. It likes about, because the video card has a back plane on it, it likes about the thickness of that back plane. And even then it overhangs maybe a 32nd of an inch on the video card. So this is about a 1/4 of an inch too tall. So we're only going to be able to test it in one place, and that's going to be on the motherboard. And yes, there's going to be some that are going to say, well, that's the only place that we're interested. Okay, remember where all this testing started. Quad adapters, then dual adapters, then we got into the heat sinks because the dual adapter is looking for a cooling solution. So if you've been following what we've been doing, that's where all that came from. If you just come into this, then all this is foreign. So instead of doing 2 tests, we'll do 1 test, and only that 1 drive, and only on the motherboard. We'll set the adapter aside. Now the next one we will be able, because it's a little bit shorter, to test it in both places, which makes my job easier. So on we go to the motherboard. It's close, but I can install that without having to remove the video card. And my clearance, get a little more light here on the subject, see if that'll help. I am pretty close. How close? I've got maybe a 1/4 of an inch away from the GPU. And that, of course, again to reiterate, has a back plane on it that's about maybe a 1/16 of an inch. It looks like it's an 1/8, but it's got a lip that curls over on it. So we're about an 1/8 to 3/16 away from the video card from that heatsink. And I can't get this down in there, but it'll give you some idea of that spacing right there. It clears, but it would not work in the primary slot. And if the GPU were on top of it, no way. It's only working in the second slot. So I hope that clarification helps. Okay, we've got to put the screw to it, and the screwdriver that some of you make fun of. Gil, get the big one out. I did. Because of the depth of the case, I've got to be able to take this little double screw that Gigabyte, in their infinite wisdom, decided to use. Those 2 pieces are put together, and I've now got to apply that screw on that heatsink. I'll get it started, then I will go to another screwdriver that is very long, but a whole lot thinner, and get that installed. And the question is, how well is that going to perform? Okay, secure and set. So quick inventory. GPU is good. We restored power to the Thunderbolt card. We had removed the power taps when we were using the ASRock card, which we had done in our last test. So I've restored power now to Thunderbolt 3, which is in the second 8-lane slot. And our primary 8-lane slot is still open. And could we install our Supermicro Dual M.2 NVMe adapter with one stick of memory on it, just for clearance? It will fit, but I have to slide it over just a little bit. And with the Supermicro Dual M.2 NVMe adapter pushed right up next to that heatsink, I'm going to come out just a little bit, but I could not attach the screw here on top to secure that card. That heatsink is too wide. So when push comes to shove on whether I can use a slot or a cooler, slot's going to win every time. Because as most of you know, PCI Express resources are a pretty precious commodity. And anything below a high-end desktop, they're scarce as hen's teeth. But on a high-end desktop, like the TRX 40, especially the Designaire, with two 16-lane slots and two 8-lane slots? No. But I got to hold my thoughts. I got to see what kind of results we get. We got to still know where the numbers are. But so far, I don't like the space relations on this particular cooler. It's tight. Okay. Inventory. GPU is set. Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 is set. Quad adapter is set, and the JEYI FinsCold iGlacier8 is installed, set, and secure on top of the WD Black SN850. So we need to power up the machine, plug it in, turn it on. We're going to energize, and then we'll watch the sequence. We've got power to the video card. We'll see our post codes. We're going to hear our PC speaker here in the top right, and as soon as we have post, we don't need to go into the BIOS because we've already talked about bifurcation. So we'll go straight into Windows. We'll verify the drive, then we'll do our test. I hear the speaker. Power on self-test passed. That is a big deal. Oh, and by the way, welcome to BuildOrBuy. My name's Gil Boyd. I want to thank you for joining us. Windows. And the first thing we need to do is verify our drive. It may take a minute to populate the disk. So we'll go to Windows flag E, this PC, and yep, there's our drive. Okay, the WD Black SN850. That's the label on the drive that we've done within Windows. It still sees it. It's on the motherboard, so we're good to go. Next step, the test. So we're going to bring up hardware info. We're looking at sensors only. And the telemetry we're looking at, we're going to scroll down to the WD Black SN850, is the smart telemetry because the drives are not in RAID. If they were in RAID, we would not have this information. We start with a cold boot of 32 degrees, and because I do not have the Supermicro card installed, we don't have information on what's going on with the Samsung 980 Pro. So we're looking at the minimum, maximum, and average. We'll bring up Crystal Disk Mark, which is drive letter D, 1 terabyte, 1 gigabyte test file, all. The first thing we'll establish will be the 7,000 megabytes on the read. We will achieve our maximum temperature when we get to the second number of the megabytes on the right. So we know the Supermicro Dual M.2 NVMe adapter is spec'd out at PCI Express 3, and as you can see, because we have a PCI Express 4.0 second generation drive on there, we get over 7,000 megabytes. I had no idea when we started this heatsink thing that it was going to be such a big deal and grow so, but it's absolutely fascinating. But whichever one you use, whatever you decide upon, any heatsink is better than no heatsink. And again, the faster we go, the hotter we go. And remember, this is a burst mode test. This is not an actual throughput test. Test is complete, and we topped out at 48 degrees. Impressive. I think now we need to look at the chart. I'll give you the key to the map. First of all, heatsinks on the left, number 1 through 22, because this is actually 21, but it's heatsink number 13. Because we have tested so far 12, this makes 13. Then we've tested 3 quad cards, Asus, Gigabyte, and ASRock. And I have highlighted in red where our best temperatures have come from. And if you'll notice on the chart, number 9, the Acidalie 4-pipe at 48 degrees. And what we have found at 48 degrees on the JEYI Aluminum FinsCold iGlacier8. Pablo said something would beat the Acidalie, and I guess he knew something I didn't, but now we're sharing it with you. I still prefer the Acidalie 4-pipe. It fits in lots of locations. I can put it on a quad card. What I have found out, even though this gets an equal temperature, I cannot put that on a dual adapter. And forget about a quad card. So to reiterate, the Acidalie will work on a dual adapter, whereas this particular JEYI iGlacier8 will not. But I'm impressed by the temperature. So 48 degrees has been our best. And looking at the key, number 1, the WD Black SN850, 92 degrees. That was the drive bare. Number 2 on the TRX40 designator, the second heatsink at 65 degrees. And that was in that location with one thermal pad with the stock heatsink that comes with a Gigabyte TRX40 designator motherboard. And that drive at 48 degrees equals the Acidalie at 48 degrees. But I still prefer the Acidalie for a heat pipe because it'll fit. So again, absolutely fascinating. I did not expect, I got to be honest, I did not expect to get that good a result. So Pablo, I want to thank you for this opportunity. This is BuildOrBuy. My name is Gil Boyd. We're on to the next video. We're out.